Hey, welcome along to another video edition of Mark's Mailbox. This is where we pick up a few of the questions that I didn't get to during our live audio session around the planet in our recent Clubland Q&A, where particularly in the final moments, torrents of questions come in and we don't want to let them go unanswered. So that's what I'm going to be doing. We're going to be answering, when I say we're going to be answering your questions, I don't mean we're, I mean I. My co-host hasn't shown up. It was, I think it was Katy Perry we had scheduled for today, but she's late. Anyway, Oscar writes, Mark, in your post on empathy or lack thereof, you talked about the inability of some people to put themselves in the shoes of those who lived some years ago, even centuries ago. Do you also advocate empathy towards those who live today, but in countries with non-Western cultures like Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, or the like? With respect, Oscar, I think you're confusing what I said about empathy, and in fact, what empathy is. Empathy is the ability to understand another man's experience as he lives it. So, for example, if you go back to the late 18th century when William Wilberforce set about abolishing slavery, you could find judges in the United Kingdom and in what's now Canada who were prepared to rule that the idea of a slave is repugnant to the laws of England. But most people at that time, even though the vast majority of them were not slaveholders, thought that slavery was a permanent feature of life as much as the earth or the sky or the clouds or the sea or whatever, because it had existed throughout the whole of human history. So how you go about changing people's assumptions requires you to first understand those assumptions. And so it's not a question of advocating empathy. If you don't, with say, primitive cultures, you've mentioned Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, for example. It's useful, particularly if you've spent, 17 years running around the Hindu Kush since the United States and its allies went in there after October. In October 2001, after 9/11, it's actually vital to be able to understand how those guys think. I'll give you, and this is what empathy is, to try to understand another human being as he understands his life. Now, when you're a Western politician, you bleed about multiculturalism, but you actually think we live in a unicultural world where everybody's all the same. So that when you go into Afghanistan, you think that every Pushtun goatherd just wants a nice car parked in his front yard and a 200-channel cable subscription. In fact, the Pushtun goatherd's conception of the world is fundamentally different. I'll give you a critical example. We care about every death in Afghanistan because the United States and the United Kingdom and Australia and Canada and the other allies are all countries which have very low fertility rates, i.e., when somebody from a Western nation dies in Afghanistan, you might be killing that couple's only child or half their children. Whereas if you look at the fertility rate of Afghanistan, which is just a little shy of 7, if everybody in your village has 7 kids, losing one kid in an ongoing war, actually, that's looked at in a different way. That simple arithmetic and the reality of large families, where you have 7 kids by the time you're 24, as opposed to having one yuppie designer kid at the age of 39 or 42. That fact alone actually changes how you look on random sudden death. life expectancy in Afghanistan, childhood mortality rates are very different. So you're up against an enemy, for example, that has a far greater capacity to absorb death when young. Doesn't mean you agree with it, doesn't mean you think high childhood mortality rates are good. But it's important, if you're going to spend, as I said, 17 years running around that god-awful benighted bit of sod, to actually have some comprehension of how these guys think within their own frame of reference. In that sense, it's easier invading Norway. It's easier invading Sweden, because you're invading a place that doesn't think so very differently. But the empathy, the ability to understand how people think within their own frame of reference is vital. Joe Patterson writes, Mark, what do you make of the left's sudden infatuation with Muslim attire? For instance, Macy's has introduced a line of attire appealing to Muslims, and the UK recently promoted a World Hijab Day. Yeah, I mentioned this when we did a Mark Steyn show with Raheel Raza, that it would astonish Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was obviously the founder of Pakistan. Raheel's was born there. It would astonish Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, the first Governor General of independent Pakistan, to discover that there are more hijabs, there are more covered women at the Imperial Parliament in Westminster than there were in his fledgling parliament 70 years ago. And the reason is, obviously, there's a kind of mainstreaming of it. Everybody does these World Hijab Days. They had one in Minneapolis, where I think it was the mayor, the lady mayor, and the lady police chief all climbed into the hijab and said, isn't this great? We're wearing it. And the idea that it's just a fashion accessory is actually very important to the way they're doing these things. They even have a name for it. They call it Prada Islam. In Europe, that these stylish, dashing Muslimas can wear all kinds of different coverings. Why, they've even got some for Remembrance Day in Britain and the Commonwealth. They've even got some with poppies all over them. It's so delightful. It's so charming. My favourite example of this kind of mainstreaming of Muslim female attire broadly exists to remind Muslim women that they are the creatures of their menfolk. And these little accessorized fashion touches are designed to distract gullible Western rubes from that central fact. My favorite example was this German lingerie company that made a super hip TV commercial a couple of years ago. I'm sure it won tons of awards from the advertising industry. It started like in an apartment in Germany, and the camera's there, and the beautiful woman is getting ready for a night out on the town, and she's making sure she's looking at her face. She's in the bathroom. She's in bra and panties, and it's stylish, super hot lingerie, and we're admiring the swell of her breast and the curve of her bottom. I may be getting warming to my theme a little too much here. And then at the very last moment, just before she goes through the door, she pulls over her the full burqa and goes out for this hot chick in the fabulous skimpy lingerie, goes out for her night on the town in a full burqa. Now, obviously, a couple of points can be made about this. Obviously, the actress running around in her scanties in the apartment is not a Muslim woman, because if you're a Muslim actress and you're thinking, oh, I'd like to have that role where I play the cool girl in the stylish, sexy lingerie and then slip the burqa on, you can't take that role because you'll be killed if your menfolk see you taking that role. You'll be, thrown off the balcony or set alight or left at the bottom of the Rideau Canal in Kingston, Ontario, like those 4 unfortunate ladies from Montreal a couple of years ago. So obviously it's a fake in the sense that it's some infidel actress pretending to be the hot Muslim chick. But it's also a fake in a broader sense as well, in that the garb she is wearing is not the garb of single women who go out for a night on the town. And the lies The lies that Western nations tell themselves as they Islamize are becoming increasingly pathetic. David Watson writes about my discussion. We had a little brief discussion comparing US and Canadian constitutions. And David says that I wisely noted that both are guidelines for honourable people. In an era when laws are often decided by 9 judges split 5-4, honour seems to be flexible. Yeah, I think actually the phrase I used, David, was virtuous people. Whether you're a republic or a constitutional monarchy, it assumes virtue in the overwhelming majority of the people. Liberty assumes virtue. Liberty is not about freedom. Freedom is absolute. You can have freedom to have sex with a goat if a hot goat comes walking past your house. But liberty is more than that. Liberty is not just about freedom, but about responsibility and virtue as well. And David suggests it's probably better to teach honourable discourse in our failing schools and defend our exercise of it thereafter. Antifa and Islam will only succeed in shutting down discourse if we allow it. Accepting undesired outcomes of the courts, elections, college policies, internet posters can be learned. Ultimately, relationships are between people. Constitutions don't make that much difference, except to prevent individuals from demanding it their way. Well, I personally agree with that point, but Larry Robinson didn't. He said, regarding your closing sentence, I would offer that the American Constitution has literally made all the difference in the world. Over time, the general observance of it and reverence for it has been instrumental in creating the powerhouse that is the USA, the most successful nation in history. And that's a very true point, and actually quite unusual. I mean, Americans talk about the United States as the new world and Europe as the old world. But as I often point out, America has had the same constitution since whatever it is, 1781 now. Whereas if you look at Europe, the constitutions of Portugal, Spain, Greece date back to the disco era. France's dates back to the late 1950s. Italy and Germany a couple of years before. They have not been successful in writing down their basic law and living by it from generation to generation. And I think that that's the more common experience with constitutions. In a sense, the British tradition that you see in Canada and Belize and Jamaica and whatnot is slightly, subtly different because it's rooted in common law assumptions about unwritten law and unwritten rights. But in Europe, they do write everything down, and then they find that they have to write it down all over again. It's the old Punch joke where the guy comes into the library and asks the librarian, where do I find the French Constitution? And she says it's filed under periodicals. Periodically, they change it. And that's why they're on their 5th republic, whereas Americans are on the 1st. But the lesson, I think, is true, that people can outgrow their constitution. And when that happens, you can either deform it, you can either do what judges do today to torture the plain meaning of language into meaning something else. But it is dangerous to assume that, and you see it in the reaction to a lot of news stories, it is dangerous to assume that a reverence for the Constitution can be transmitted from generation to generation if nobody bothers to do that. Pradeep Kumar. Pradeep says, Mark, isn't self-defense an inalienable right? To the extent that anyone delegates it to others, the police, etc., it does not mean that it has to be irrevocably surrendered. I think this is what the sheriff of Broward County and others are arguing for, where basically They're saying in a high-tech society, you can mortgage all your security rights to the state, and the state will protect you. And I agree with you that isn't the right to self-defense, which has been dangerously nibbled away at in the UK and other places. For example, where judges rule you can only have proportionate response. So if you wake up in the middle of the night and some guy's broken into your bedroom, you have to wait and see whether he pulls a gun or a knife on you before you can decide how to respond. Otherwise, like a famous case a couple of years ago, if you're a farmer who shoots a guy and the guy doesn't appear to have a gun himself, you will be hauled up in court for a disproportionate response. You have to wait. If he pulls out a sharp knife, then you can reach for the cricket bat under your bed. If he pulls out a gun, then you can reach for the rusty shotgun. But you basically have to allow him to select his weapon first. This is nonsense. Self-defense is a basic human right, and insofar as we license it in part to anybody, then I think, not to go all constitutional on you, I think it's a bit like the letters patent from Her Majesty the Queen to the Governor-General of New Zealand a few years ago, basically empowering him to exercise powers on her behalf. The Queen can take those letters patent back at any time and revise them as we so wish. And I think what is interesting here is that whatever the people feel about the situation in American schools, what's more interesting to watch in the long run is whether, in view of, say, the epidemic of sexual violence in Germany and Scandinavia and places, whether Europeans start to take a greater interest in their self-defense rights. Jorge Pereira writes, Mark, whenever some fella named Mohammed or Akbar starts shouting Aloha Snack Bar, don't think you got that quite right, George, and using planes, trains, butcher knives, cars, guns, our obviously better educated betters tell us it's got nothing to do with Islam, but that the perpetrators are mentally ill. When there is a school shooting, our obviously better educated superiors tell us it's got nothing to do with mental illness and is only the fault of the gun, which is the most dangerous weapon ever created. What am I missing here? You're actually making a very good point, George. CNN had a big town hall immediately after the Florida school shooting where everyone's talking about what are we going to do about guns? We've got to have gun control. We've got to ban every particular gun shooting in America is an example of why is a particular example of the general problem, which is guns. When some guy goes full Allahu Akbar, it doesn't matter whether that's at the Boston Marathon, doesn't matter whether it's at San Bernardino, doesn't matter whether it's on a bike path in Manhattan. For some reason, we never have a big CNN town hall saying, oh, what are we going to do about Islam? Or even, what are we going to do about immigration? Which is certainly relevant. Or even, what are we going to do about chain migration or diversity lotteries? No, to modify Tip O'Neill, all jihad is local. It's just about itself. It has no general... You may notice something similar that these guys all seem to shout at the last minute as they're going around doing this and doing that, but has no general application. And you saw the contrast with the fellow called Omar Mateen, who shot up the gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, same place as the school shooting. He killed 49 people. Biggest mound of gay corpses in American history. Biggest gay slaughter ever. Back in the 90s, when one gay guy was hung on a fence in Wyoming, the issue was homophobia from Maine to Hawaii, from Alaska to Florida. When you have 49 gay guys slaughtered in a nightclub, the issue was not homophobia. Nobody talked about that. The issue wasn't Islam either. No. Even there, in 49 people killed by a Muslim who hates homosexuals, and it's all to do with guns. And that was interesting to me. That even the gay guys who are some of the noisiest lobby groups in our society, just fell into line on that. Very interesting. What do we got? I can't quite follow this. Many conservative speakers are banned or shadow banned from Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. This is on the grounds of fake news or hate speech, says Alan Miller. Looking on the bright side, it seems that these mighty global organizations have now solved two questions which trouble mankind for millennia. How do we know what is true? Now that's very easy. If it's fake news, then it's not true. And how do we know what is evil? And that's very easy too. If something is called racist or fascist, then it's evil. However, we need to take one final step. Now that the CEOs of Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube have solved these two problems and are imposing their diktat on all users worldwide, in our new borderless world, shouldn't these philosophical titans also be selected democratically? So shouldn't we have a worldwide election for the CEOs of these corporations, which now settle the issues of what speech is allowed and what is good and evil? That's an interesting point, Alan. You talk about shadow banning. These big social media cartels are basically shadow states. They're bigger than a lot of nation states, and they kind of operate globally in the cracks between nation states. And it's interesting to me. I don't even know, for example, how actively these CEOs, although it's always disturbing to see Zuckerberg palling it up with Angela Merkel and promising to do her bidding on silencing and repressing free speech in Germany and all the rest of it. What's interesting to me is that it's algorithms, that people are able to design algorithms that will shadow ban persons of one particular viewpoint, but not persons of another. And at some point, someone's going to make a horror movie about how, in the end, an algorithm breaks loose and starts running the world. These are very subtle things. People don't even know they're shadow banned. You can micro tweak these algorithms to perform all kinds of subtle things for you. And there's no reason why that should just be confined to social media. I mean, the Pfizer court, for example, I mentioned this guy, Frank Maas, a judge I had the dubious privilege of sitting across a table from for 7 hours one day. He's one of these Pfizer court judges who rubber stamped the one that got this dodgy Russian dossier by Christopher Steele, the ex-MI6 spook. That created the whole so-called Russia investigation. He was in on the ground floor of that case. 99.97% of Pfizer applications are approved by the judge. So who actually needs a Pfizer court judge? Even a rubber stamp Pfizer court judge like this Mars guy. Why couldn't we just have one of these Russian bots that everyone's excited about? Why can't the Russian bot just rubber stamp the Pfizer court cases? Or the Macedonian content farms that Hillary says cost her the election. All those gnarled old Macedonian content farmers on the porch of their weathered old Macedonian content farms, getting out the gadulka of an evening and strumming the ancient Macedonian content farming songs of their people. Why couldn't the Macedonian content farmers actually rubber stamp the design a Macedonian algorithm to rubber stamp the Pfizer application? My view is this, that eventually a Macedonian content farm algorithm will be running the entire world. You can laugh at me, but 3 or 4 years from now, Marvel is going to be releasing Black Panther versus the Macedonian content algorithm, or Peter Rabbit versus the Macedonian content algorithm. That's even scarier. I'll see you next time, if I'm not replaced by an algorithm.